In 1888 London, Whitechapel to be more exact, there was a several-month span of 5 grisly murders that were believed to have all been committed by one man. Murders that spread far amongst the already starving and hopeless people of the time. We still do not know who is responsible for these heinous crimes. We have given him a name. That name is Jack the Ripper. Hey Wanderers! Welcome back to another Foolish Wanderers podcast, the podcast about anything and everything. Welcome back to the final 2-part episode of Spooktober 2024, and today we have our friend Max with us.
Back again like a bad penny.
Like a bad penny?
No! This is fun.
You thought you lost me, but I'm back.
We're glad you're back. It's fun. You're back. You were here last Halloween. Kendra has a penny.
That's me.
Boom.
What year is it, Kendra?
2020. That's why I have it.
Oh,
Because it's
That is
literally
a
a
bad
bad
penny.
penny.
That's the worst penny.
It's the worst
No.
penny.
Oh man, that's great. Okay, so today, or did you want to plug like any of your socials or like
Yeah,
your
plug.
YouTube video and stuff?
Plug away.
All right, let's see how fast I can do this. Okay, so on YouTube, it's my name. That's Max Chivington. That's MAXCHIVINGTON. And then I have a gaming channel called The Star Munchers, all one word. On Instagram, I'm Max_K_draws. And my podcast, Morphing Tower Podcast, is on most major podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, etc. Boom.
Beautiful.
That was
You have it
quick.
down.
Jeez.
Very good, very nice. So we're gonna get into, for this first episode, well I guess this whole 2-part series we're gonna do for Halloween, the wrap-up of Spooktober 2024. I'm gonna be talking about a certain TikToker who made a video of why she thinks that Edgar Degas, the painter of like ballerinas, was actually Jack the Ripper, who was a heinous serial killer that we still don't know the actual identity of, but this one kind of makes sense. This theory makes sense. So this part 1 episode is going to be talking more about Jack the Ripper himself and like the main story of him and like all the gory details. So major trigger warning if you don't want to hear anything about murder or like details of how people were murdered, anything like that, anything to do with blood, gore, please skip this episode. We understand. It's gonna get gnarly. So, are you guys ready to hear about Jack the Ripper?
Never heard of him.
I feel
Oh.
so bad for Edgar Degas.
Do you? Because I know. Okay, so Kendra, when I brought this up to Kendra to like ask if she wanted to do this, she said that Edgar Degas is one of her favorite artists. And now I'm like, oh no.
Wow.
Also that you... Katrina, also that you introduced him as the man that paints ballerinas.
Ballerinas. Well, that's what like he's mainly known for. Like, if you showed
I
me,
know, but like it makes it's kind of like Georgia O'Keeffe. They'd be like the lady that paints women genitalia flowers, or
Oh, no.
or like Andy Warhol's the Campbell Soup label man.
But wouldn't
Yeah.
that be helpful in art books if they just did that, honestly? Like, most famous work, it's this. Like, you know.
It is. I mean, it is, but it also. I mean, it's totally helpful. It's just it kind of is like just like a tinge, kind of just sad because of how much they accomplished in their life,
I'm
and then it's
sorry.
just like. But I totally get it. I think it's funny. The ballerina man,
I'm
the-
sorry.
the tiny
Like,
dancer, painter man.
so in part 2, we'll get into much more of like what he kind of did. I didn't go super in depth with like all of his paintings and stuff because he did a lot. He did like started out. He did like a lot of copying work of like when he was very first learning of like Monet or like Michelangelo. That's one of them. There's a bunch of like he went to the Louvre and like copied artists and stuff. Kind of studied that. He did a lot of different stuff, and we'll talk about it in part 2. But like if you think of what he's done. The last kind of era of him was ballerinas and ladies. So
He was
I
in
mean,
his ballerina era.
He
was.
was in his
He truly
ballerina
was.
era. Yeah.
He was. Alrighty, so let's start off with a theory. And this is what hooked me on this podcast. Alright, So to start off, a couple months ago, I came across a TikTok from Kiki Shear. She's on TikTok. I'll leave a link to her TikTok down in the description if you guys want to check it out. It is one that I immediately saved for a future podcast. In this TikTok, Kiki explained her theory of how she thinks that the famous and beloved artist Edgar Degas would have very well been Jack the Ripper. If you're not familiar with Jack the Ripper, he was a horrific serial killer that killed at least 5 women that we know of. In Whitechapel, which is a district of London, in 1888. He had the habit of slitting their throats before mutilating their bodies, and it gave rise to a feverish speculation, offers of cash rewards, a media frenzy, and an in-depth police investigation of 11 murders committed over 3 years that had some commonalities. So, if you think of Jack the Ripper, the main 5 that we're going to be talking about, those are the ones that people think, like, for sure he did, like, this one person did. But there's a few other ones, like, throughout the next couple of years that had similarities, but they weren't, like, exactly the same. They weren't exactly the same MO. So it's kind of hard to tell if he did all of them or just the 5.
And Jack the Ripper's, like, the first serial killer, like, documented, or just the first one to go viral that they were able to connect,
My guess is
multiple
probably...
deaths to.
My guess, this is pure speculation on my part, but
Mhm.
probably like timing out with like the idea of like media and like the printed word, like the idea of a murderer becoming semi-popular because of like newspapers and frenzy of just
Mhm.
like this is happening. So probably not the first technically serial killer like throughout history, but probably one of the first most notable ones to have like basically newspapers following their exploits.
Yeah, and we'll kind of get into, like, some of the letters he supposedly wrote too. So that was part of it, and then, like you said, Max, like, the press got a hold of it and kind of ran with it. But I don't know if you guys remember, like, last Halloween, or it was Halloween, I think I put it out, when we did H.H. Holmes. This was, like, the same time, and he was a serial killer as well. So,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. So, yeah. And
Never heard of him.
Oh, okay, well.
Well, you might want to re-listen to your own podcast episode you were on.
No, I immediately unlearned all that stuff because I
Okay,
knew I needed to
that's
show
fine.
up today and be a fool. You guys do the research. I am the fool.
I don't think I, like, scratched the surface of, like, everything to talk about for Jack the Ripper, because there's so much. Like, you can go on a massive wormhole. I just kind of scratched the surface and was like, okay, here's the main points.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what we do on this podcast.
It is. We're very, do a little bit
Hence
of
the
research.
name.
And just talk for, like, an hour and a half.
Yeah.
I believe Kendra called it dipping toes and flapping jaws, is how
Yep.
she described it.
Yep.
Yep.
That's
Yep.
exactly how I describe this podcast to people.
How many people have you told that that's what we do, like, in your everyday life?
Kendra's
I
currently
mean,
trying to remember
I
how many people
don't-
she knows.
Yeah.
Oh.
I mean, I don't keep track of the number, but
That's
like the last time I had mentioned it was at a family function. People asked me, like,
Ooh.
you go from you have these family functions that you see these people 2 times a year, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the time it's just like the weather's been warm, and then it goes into after the weather talk, and then it goes into, so what have you been doing? And you go, work, and they go, all right, and sometimes it'll go more into the third layer, which is like hobbies, and then that's when the dipping of toes and flapping of jaws line comes out.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mhm.
Beautiful.
Third layer.
Third,
family
what's the
functions.
second?
Second is you go like, well, what have you been up to? And you go, you do work and this and that around the house, and the eggs are so expensive and
Mhm.
stuff like that.
It's Midwestern
Yeah.
NPC dialogue. It's weather.
Mhm.
What are you
Weather's
up to
number
in
one.
life? Are you doing
Yep.
anything for fun?
Yep.
And that's where the dipping
Mhm.
toes and flapping jaws comes from.
Mhm. Third layer. Yep.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Okay, so I don't remember if I set it up, but Jack the Ripper, we still don't know who he was, or if it even is a guy. So to this day, the cases all remain unsolved. So now we're going to get into actual, like, history of the Canonical Five and, like, what their lives were like. And I'm going to kind of explain what life was like in Whitechapel, because it was pretty horrible. Okay.
I know that because of the Assassin's Creed game.
I think you've told me that before, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
This is
Okay, so we're going to take a trip back to 1888 London, England, and more specifically, Whitechapel. Life there was hopeless, dark, and miserable. Whitechapel's mazes of roads, alleyways, and courtyards were only lit by a single gas lamp, making the streets incredibly dark. Sheep and cattle were often herded through the streets, leaving trails of excrement behind them. Not only that, residents themselves would often throw raw sewage into the streets. So the smells drifting through the area would have been unbearable to any outsider. It was also a land of zero opportunity, with the people struggling to find employment and often resorting to petty theft and prostitution to make ends meet. The residents of Whitechapel suffered from depravity, destitution, and poverty, and to make things even worse, an ominous killer was lurking in the streets. So, in the early half of the Victorian era, the East End, where Jack and his victims resided, was nothing more than rural land, but following the acceleration of the Industrial Revolution, Whitechapel soon became absorbed by the growing metropolis that was London. With dockyards and space aplenty, Whitechapel and East End in general became the first port of call for migrants seeking a better life. Unfortunately, what they found when they arrived was a mass slum, an area where wealthy business people would set up shop and just run away. They wouldn't return to run it, they just let it go, basically. Crime was rife in London in 1888, with pickpockets aplenty and thieves at every turn. The poorest members of society wound up there. And despite the crime rate, the East End had never seen a criminal like Jack the Ripper before, and its legacy for which is now known around the world. So basically, when you think of Whitechapel, the first thing that usually comes to mind is Jack the Ripper. Okay, so although some areas of Whitechapel during this time were relatively crime-free and had law-abiding citizens, there's no denying that its slums were some of the worst in the city. Around 15,000 of Whitechapel's residents were homeless and unemployed, and the little money that they had often went to downing their sorrows in the area's countless pubs. Not just limited to poverty and crime rates, Whitechapel was also overcrowded in its poorer areas. Up to 2 or 3 entire families would be crammed into sometimes one small room because they couldn't afford to pay rent anywhere else. And these families in Whitechapel would have most likely considered themselves lucky, as there were lodgings, quote unquote, in the neighborhood where up to 80 other people would be crammed into one room for about 4 pence a bed, which is about 4 cents then and about 6.5 pounds today, or like dollars. And for a tuppence, which is 2 pence, about $3.30, you could sleep sitting on a bench and slung over a rope. You could only sleep, however, if you were slung over that rope. And this is where they think the term hangover came from. Basically, you would just sit on a bench and like lean over this rope that's strapped to the wall.
So hold just a gosh darn minute.
Okay.
Is this rope behind you or in front of you?
It's in front of you.
So you put your butt on a bench and you lay your torso over a rope and just drape like a cat?
Yeah, there's pictures of it and it's really sad.
It kind of sounds comfortable.
I mean, it depends on how tall you are, because if you're have a much taller torso, you're gonna be the rope wouldn't matter. Your head would be on your knees anyways. There's pictures of people at different heights, but you had to be leaning over this rope, otherwise they kick you out. You're like, no.
You gotta bring that back to really ritzy hotels and sell it like an authentic experience for these rich people who think it's really, really cool and artsy to do it, where they just get a nice bench. And here, sir and madam, is your sleeping rope. Enjoy.
Yep. They'd probably do it. Give me $100. I'll give you a bench and a rope to sling over.
There's a single piece of candy in the center for your satisfaction.
Ew.
And this is where hangover comes from?
That's where they think, yeah. That's most likely where
the people were drunk and then they were...
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of the options that it could have came from. There's also a 1 pence option, or 1 penny option, of just sitting on a bench. You couldn't sleep, though, if you only paid 1 penny. You had to stay awake the entire night.
Oh my gosh.
Who's enforcing that?
Yeah, who is?
Just the people who run the DOS houses. Yeah, so basically there's a tier system where you could have a bed, a shared bed for 4 pennies. But these beds, they were I don't know, they're just a little bit of what's it called? Not cotton. Canvas, stretched over a wood frame, and there's bugs everywhere.
It's the Olympic beds all over again.
Those are those are
cardboard
royalty in this area. But yeah, no.
So you're describing the Spirit Airlines of hotels.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, we have a tier system. We have the bench, we have the rope, or we have the solid bed.
And you can
solid bed. Yes.
Oh my gosh.
And there's bugs everywhere. They never got cleaned. So yeah. So you're just paying basically to have a place to sit and to have a roof over your head for the night. That's basically it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And like if you had the 1 penny option, you would sit there on the bench the entire night and someone would like whack you with like a stick or something to keep you awake. Like you couldn't sleep, which is so messed up.
It's comically bad.
It's
stay
so
there.
bad. It's so
If you
bad.
fall asleep in the hotel, we'll hit you with a stick.
Yes, and like too also like people would try to sleep out like in the parks or whatever, you know, just spend the night outdoors when it's cold, you know, it's winter, and they would like get arrested or like get kicked out. It's like you couldn't sleep on the streets, but you couldn't pay for a bench to sit on, and it's just like there's no like options for you basically. So many of these DOS houses, as they were called, were damp and had little ventilation, and they were infected with insects or lacked proper sewage facilities. Yeah, and because of this, malnutrition and disease were so common, only half of the children living in Whitechapel at the time would live to see the age of 5.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Many of these, quote, homes would have been found along the streets like Flower Street, Dean Street, Dorset Street, and Thal Street, with Dorset Street being considered the worst of them all. And as a matter of fact, even the local police refused to go down Dorset Street unless they walked in groups of 4. So crime was so rampant, and it was so dark.
Never a good sign.
No, nope. So yeah, it was so dark, and like there's murders everywhere, people like yelling and drinking and everything all at once. So that by the late 1800s, around 900,000 people called London's East End their home, with 250,000 of its inhabitants being based in Whitechapel. So
That's a lot.
it's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people to be crammed in a place that's basically kind of like a boom town, right?
Yep. With like despair around every
Yeah.
single corner.
The boomtown of despair. Maybe we should rename this to Whitechapel.
That's a better name. I like that name. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the women of Whitechapel.
Is this what you were calling the Canonical Five?
No, this is not them yet. No,
Okay.
this is just kind of like we'll get into it.
And I like that the Canonical Five sound like a fun pop group from the 60s.
I know. It's a fun name to say, but it's
Yeah.
not a fun thing to learn
Canonical
about.
5.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the
It's fun.
Jackson 5.
The Jackson Five,
But canonical.
but canonical.
So, although the men living in Whitechapel often struggled to find work, for women it was even worse. It was incredibly difficult for women in Whitechapel to find employment by the late 1800s, and many had no choice but to resort to prostitution just to make ends meet. During the Victorian ages, around 1,200 prostitutes were working in Whitechapel alone. Some experts say that it could have been much higher. And life was so difficult for these women, they would often sell themselves for as little as 3 pennies, or for just a stale loaf of bread.
Not even fresh?
No.
They're probably worth fresh.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Sadly, also, whenever a prostitute was murdered, it was rarely reported in the press or discussed about in other areas of London, which still
Right.
kind of happens today, which is really messed up.
Oh, still today, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Which led to countless of these women being subjected to physical attacks by their customers, which was also one of the leading factors as to why Jack the Ripper got away with murder for so many months before officials finally started to take notice and like piece it together. All right, so now we're getting into more of the lore of Jack. So it is believed that Jack the Ripper started his violent murder spree in 1888 London/Whitechapel. There were several dozen murders between 1888 and 1892 that have been supposedly attributed to Jack the Ripper. Only 5 of those murders, which are all committed in like within a few months in 1888, were linked by the police to a single murderer. These victims were dubbed the Canonical Five. The victims' names are Mary Ann Nichols, whose body was found on August 31st, Annie Chapman, who was found September 8th, Elizabeth Stride, found September 30th, Catherine Eddowes, found September 30th as well. That was a double murder day, and Mary Jane Kelly, who was found November 9th. And according to the common assumption at the time, all the victims were prostitutes of some sort, and all but one of them, Kelly, was murdered while soliciting on the street. But now we're going to get into their respective lives, and let me know if I need to cut anything out, because I sure can. I have like 3 pages per person.
Wait, you have like bios of the Canonical Five?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want me to skip over it, or do you want me to like go through it?
No, I'm kind of interested because now I've like attributed them like to a band. So now I'm like, which one is Posh Spice? Which one is Baby Spice? Which one is Sporty? I'm just
Okay, yeah.
Let's
Let me
go.
know which one matches up with which.
all right. Marianne
Okay,
Nichols,
so-
who are you?
Okay, cool. So Mary Ann Nichols was the very first murder victim of Jack's. So on the 31st of August, 1888, the horrifically mutilated body of a woman was found in an entranceway in Bucks Row in Whitechapel. Later that day, she was identified as Mary Ann Nichols, better known to her family, friends, and acquaintances as Polly Nichols. She would be the first of the now called Canonical Five. So Mary/Polly was born on August 26th, 1845, and she was married to William Nichols at the age of 18. They had a lovely marriage at first, at least that was what was believed by everyone around them. The couple had 5 children together. Not long after the last child was born, Mary and William divorced. Mary's father accused William of leaving his daughter after William had an affair with the nurse that had helped deliver their last child. So William had claimed that their separation was more brought on by Mary's drinking habit. He had only gotten with the nurse after he and Mary were no longer together. But there must have been like some sort of flirting or something, because yeah, that probably helped push the separation a little bit further. Shortly after leaving her husband and 5 kids, Mary's life became a downward spiral, blighted by poverty and alcoholism. At first, William was legally required to pay Mary a weekly allowance to support her. However, when he heard that she was working as a prostitute, he stopped, leaving her to fend for herself. Mary spent the last few years of her life in and out of workhouses and other common lodging houses or doss houses. The cost of a night's lodging at these establishments was 4 pence, but on the night of the 30th of August, she didn't have enough to pay for a room that night and was denied a night's doss at Wilmot Common Lodging House. So the workhouses, I'll just kind of briefly touch on it. That's a whole nother thing if you guys want to look it up. But the workhouses were basically the last place you wanted to go. They're for people who were extremely down on their luck, didn't have any money, and just needed some place to try to get ahead. But a lot of these places would like take the money from the government and just use it for their own, like the boss's family or whatever. Like they wouldn't feed people in the actual workhouses. So like people, I forget the name of the worst one, but there was one where like people, there's like different random jobs. Like one was like crushing rocks, one was like doing dishes, and one was bone crushing. And there's this one workhouse where it got so bad, like there's no food anywhere, so people would fight for bone crushing duty, so that way they could like scramble to the bones with the bone marrow in the middle and eat that. So like that's how desperate they were for food, because they just ignored these people. So yeah, workhouses were not good. But you could go there for free, and it's meant to be a good thing, but just turned out not so much. All right. So going back to Mary, at approximately 11 p.m. on August 30th, Nichols was seen walking along Whitechapel Road. She visited the Frying Pan, a public house in Brick Lane, leaving around 12:30 a.m. on the 31st of August. By 1:20 a.m., she had returned to the kitchen of her Flower and Dean Street lodging house. 50 minutes later, she was seen by the deputy lodging house keeper, who asked her for 4 pence required for her bed. When Nichols replied she didn't have the money, she was ordered to leave the premises. Not too concerned, Nichols mentioned her new black velvet bonnet, replying, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." And it might be worth noting, no one really knows where she got this bonnet from, because like if she had no money, this was like a decently like expensive item, especially with like the velvet. So no one knows if she took it or if someone gave it to her, or if she had like a guy she was seeing. No one really knows, but she had it that night. She then left the lodging house with a likely intention of earning the money to pay for a bed via prostituting herself. Nichols was last seen alive by her friend Emily Holland, walking alone down Osborne Street at approximately 2:30 a.m. Around 3:40 a.m., a carman, Charles Cross, saw something laying in front of the gated stable entrance and Bucks Row. When he got closer, he saw that it was a woman. Another passing cart driver on his way to work, Robert Paul, approached the location and observed Cross standing in the road, staring at her body. Cross called him over, and both men walked towards the body, which they examined. Cross touched the woman's face, which was still warm, then her hands, which were cold. The 2 men went to find a policeman. Upon encountering Police Chief Jonas Misen, who is one of the main police chiefs in this whole case, at the corner of Hanbury Street and Baker's Row, Cross informed the constable of their discovery, adding, "She looks to me to either be dead or drunk. By my part, I believe she's dead." So shortly before Misen reached Bucks Row, Police Chief John Neal approached the street in the opposite direction of his beat, illuminating Nichols' body with his lantern. By flashing his lantern, Neal attracted the attention of PC John Thane, as his beat passed the entrance of Bucks Row, shouting, "Here's a woman with her throat cut. Run at once for Dr. Lewin." Neal then inspected the crime scene to look for blood trails with his lantern. He saw none. He also examined the road, which had no marks of wheels. So there's no like getaway car, and there's like no blood, which is interesting because usually at a murder site there's blood everywhere. So PC Thane fetched surgeon Dr. Lewin, who arrived at Bucks Row at 4 o'clock a.m. Lewin observed that 2 deep knife wounds had been inflicted on the woman's throat and quickly pronounced her dead, determining the fact that her body and legs were still warm, that she had been dead for approximately 30 minutes. So Nichols' body was moved to the Old Montague Street mortuary at 5:20 a.m., and the injuries to her abdomen were discovered by an Inspector Spratling. So upon further examination of Nichols' body, Dr. Lewin discovered that both sides of her face had been bruised by either a fist or the pressure of a thumb before her throat wounds had been inflicted from left to right. One of these 2 wounds measured 8 inches and the other 4 inches in length. Both reached the back of her vertebral column. There were many other brutal injuries that Mary had sustained. And again, trigger warning. Her abdomen had been mutilated with 1 deep, jagged wound 3 inches from the left side. Several incisions had also been inflicted across her abdomen, causing her bowels to protrude through the wounds. 3 or 4 similar cuts ran down the side of her body. These cuts had also been inflicted with the same knife, estimated to be around 3 to 6 inches in length, and possibly a cork cutter or a shoemaker's knife. Each wound had been inflicted in a violent, downward thrusting manner. Lewin further stated his belief the murderer possessed some anatomical knowledge. No organs were missing, and it's worth mentioning there was not much blood at the crime scene at all, having the investigators conclude that the majority of her wounds were thankfully done after she was deceased. So that is the first Ripper victim. All right, and that's kind of like where they kind of piece together too, like the first suspect for them, and one that's still pretty common today, is that it was a shoemaker. So that's just because like the knife wounds, but it doesn't explain necessarily if like he knew anatomy or not, but the knife would make sense. So the second one we're going to talk about is Anne Chapman. So Anne Chapman was born Eliza Ann Smith in Paddington on September 25th, 1840. Many people described Annie Chapman as an intelligent and sociable woman with a weakness for alcohol, particularly rum. On May 1st, 1869, Annie married John James Chapman. The couple had 3 children. Sadly, one of her daughters passed away from meningitis at the age of 12. After her death, both Anne and John both took to heavy drinking. They eventually separated in 1884, and the separation was mutual. John kept custody of their oldest daughter, and Anne relocated to London. She received a weekly allowance of 10 shillings from John. Following their separation from her husband, Annie Chapman relocated to Whitechapel, primarily living on her weekly allowance of 10 shillings. Over the following years, she resided in common lodging houses in both Whitechapel and Spitalfields. By 1886, she is known to have resided with a man who made wire sieves for a living, consequently becoming known to some acquaintances as Annie Civvy or Civvy. At the end of 1886, her weekly allowance abruptly stopped. After asking why her weekly payments had ceased, Chapman discovered that her husband had tragically died of alcohol-related causes. So shortly after John's death, Anne's CV maker friend left Chapman, probably due to her not getting her weekly allowance anymore, and relocated to Nottington Hill. One of Chapman's friends said that she became depressed after the separation and seemed to lose her will to live. On September 7th, Amelia Palmer encountered Annie Chapman in Dorset Street. Palmer later informed police that Chapman had appeared visibly pale on this occasion, having been discharged from the casual ward of the Whitechapel Infirmary that day. Chapman explained to Palmer of having felt too ill to do anything. At approximately 5:15 a.m., a tenant of 27 Hanbury Street named Albert Kadash entered the yard of the property to use the lavatory. Kadash later informed police that they had heard a woman yelling, "No!" before hearing the sound of something or someone falling against the fence that divided the backyards of numbers 27 and 29 Hanbury Street. He did not, however, investigate these cries. Annie Chapman's mutilated body was discovered shortly before 6 o'clock a.m. by John Davis, an elderly resident of the 29 Hanbury Street. Davis noted that the door was now open, while the back door was shut. Her body was lying on the ground near the doorway to the backyard, her head 6 inches from the steps to the property. Davis alerted 3 men named James Green, James Kent, and Henry Holland to this discovery. Before all 3 men ran down the commercial street to find a policeman, as Davis reported his discovery to the nearest police station. So at the corner of Hanbury Street, Green, Kent, and Holland found Divisional Inspector Joseph Lunas Chandler and told him another woman has been murdered. Chandler followed the men to Chapel's body before requesting the assistance of a police surgeon, Dr. George Phillips, and more officers. Several policemen arrived within minutes, and they were instructed to clear the passageway to the yard to ensure Dr. Phillips had access. Phillips arrived at Hanbury Street at approximately 6:30 a.m. And I believe this is the only one of the 5 that this specific police station had jurisdiction over. Yeah. The other 4 were more like the London police. So Dr. Phillips was quickly able to establish a definite link between Chapman's murder and the murder of Marianne Nichols. Nichols and Chapman both had sustained the same neck wounds. It is also thought that the blade of similar size and design had been used in both murders. Chapman's throat had been cut from left to right so deeply, the bones of her vertebral column bore striations, so it cut into her bone. And she had been disemboweled, with a section of the flesh of her stomach being placed on her left shoulder, and the other section of skin and flesh, plus her small intestines, being removed and placed above her right shoulder. The morgue examination revealed that the part of her uterus and bladder was missing. Chapman's protruding tongue and swelling face led Dr. Phillips to believe that she may have been asphyxiated with a handkerchief around her neck before her throat was cut, and that her murderer had held her chin as he performed this act. Also, 2 pills, which Chapman had been prescribed for a lung condition, a section of a torn envelope, a small piece of frayed coarse muslin, and a comb were recovered close to her body. A leather apron, partially submerged in a dish of water, located close to a tap, was also discovered close to her body. The coroner who conducted Anne's autopsy also noticed that her lungs and brain membranes were in an advanced state of disease, which would have killed her within months.
I find it so interesting that I find it so interesting that the timestamps, one, but also the names of all the officers, the doctors, the fact. See, this is one of the things that's fascinating about the Whitechapel murders is obviously it's terrible that they happen, right? And with modern psychologists, they would say that a serial killer would want the press to know about what they're doing, right? But at the same time, prior to the press happening, when stuff like this happens, if you don't have a way to communicate, warn other people, let them know some details, anything. If Jack the Ripper had been doing his thing prior to newsprint being around, the odds of you being able to warn people or just write down information so that way everybody's apprised of the situations, the fact that that one doctor was immediately oh, this is that other girl who got murdered. The fact that he was able to piece that together is because of mass communication of the day. So again, you don't want to feed into the ego of some psycho who thrives off of that information, but at the same time, it's you have to let the people know what's going on. So it really all comes down to the intentions of the people spreading the word, right? It's on one hand, if you're writing stuff down because you want to keep people informed and you want to keep them safe, awesome. But I'm sure that there were plenty of other newspapers who jumped on it just to make a headline, to make a whole column that was sort of fear mongering and would get them a lot of attention. But at the same time, it's you'd rather have the hysteria of people being cautious instead of living in ignorance of the fact that there's a murderer loose in Whitechapel.
I don't know. The other thing too with the timestamps and stuff is just how close he was to being caught, and every single you hear every single murder, someone saw the victim probably maybe 20 minutes after it happened or less. Sometimes it's less, which is scary to think because he could have been caught so many times, but he wasn't.
Yep.
Yeah. How you doing, Kendra? Are you zoned out?
No, I'm good.
Oh, okay. Should we take a break with a happy fun fact?
Sure.
Okay. I asked Kendra to look up a couple of fun facts just to kind of break up the monotony and just bring a little bit of light back into this podcast.
Yeah,
all right, Kendra, it's all on your capable shoulders, Kendra. You have to help us with this. Come on, you got this.
Here we go.
We all know you've got a winner.
It is impossible to hum while holding your nose.
Yeah, I've tried that before. It's true.
Really?
Yeah, it blocks your vibrations from humming.
Really?
Yeah, try it.
Try it.
I'm gonna try it.
Okay. I think it kind of works, but
it kind of works.
It's not the same.
It's just not the same. Well, I debunked your stupid fun fact. Give us another one. How dare you spread false information on this podcast about facts?
Here we go. It's illegal to own only one guinea pig in Switzerland.
Oh.
Wait, it's illegal to only own one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's like a package deal. You
go
to the pet store and it's buy one, get another free, or
maybe. I don't know.
Why? Okay, let's
They're very, like-
let's think about laws for a second. Why do laws get made? Because of problems.
Mm-hmm.
What problem could have possibly happened that would require a law to be made that, hey, dope, buying an animal, you can't just buy one guinea pig. You're gonna buy two and you're gonna be happy about it.
Maybe like the guinea pigs, if there's only one of them, they get super depressed. So there was
They
a
do.
lot of like guinea pig suicide. So they had to make a
but
rule where you have to have two.
they're very sociable animals, and they do need someone else. Like my sister, she got so I think it was last year. She adopted 2 guinea pigs. They're supposed to be sisters. They are sisters, but one, they don't know how. One was pregnant, so now she has 4. So yeah, but yeah, they're very like they have to like have 2 usually, because otherwise they get very depressed.
See?
Like,
Guinea
So-
pig suicide, they need to stop it in Switzerland. Because Switzerland, you know, they're really into
They say
peace.
the
I don't know,
guinea
happy things.
they save the guinea pigs.
They save the guinea pigs, yeah.
They're odd little creatures, but they're cute.
All right, hold on. I'm dipping my toe. Hold on. So this is from an article. The truth about single guinea pigs. Is it okay to just have one? Getting a guinea pig, especially for the first time, can be stressful, especially if you aren't sure if you should get 1 or 2. That never occurred to me. That's just a side thing. Let's see. This question weighed heavily on many potential pet parents. Is it okay to get 1 guinea pig? Is a single guinea pig best? A pair? Typically, it's not okay for guinea pigs to live alone. Most don't do as well as single pets because they're social herd animals. I've never heard of a guinea pig described as a herd animal. So now I'm just describing like in movies where like westerns where like there's like a herd of buffalo, just like a herd of guinea pigs.
That'd be
That's happy.
adorable.
A herd
That
of
is
guinea
happy.
pigs is happy.
It is really
adorable.
happy.
They're such little plump creatures. It's funny. It's funny
Little-
watching them walk.
Fuzz potatoes.
Fudge potatoes.
Yes. Oh, cute.
You saved it, Kendra. Good job.
Thank
Yay!
you.
You
Thank you.
brought us back.
My one
Yay.
job.
Good job, Kendra. I'm proud of you. All right, now we're gonna plunge back into murder.
Oh, God.
Just
So now-
remember the herds of guinea
The
pigs.
herds
Kendra.
of guinea pigs running through wildflowers. I like that.
Oh, that's cute. Is it weird that I pictured them with like little cowboy hats?
No, it's fine.
No,
Okay.
no.
They're like, yeah, yours can be they're going through Monument Valley and they have little cowboy hats on.
I
Heck
see.
yeah.
My brain was immediately going hamster dance, but
Aw.
that's where I'm seeing the cowboy hats from. I think.
Okay, that might be where I'm getting it too. Yeah. Okay, so now we're gonna get into the double murder day.
Oh,
So
twofer.
there's a twofer. It is, yes.
Fun.
So this, the first one was Elizabeth Stride. So Elizabeth Stride was born Elizabeth Godstoffer in Sweden on the 27th of November in 1842. In 1866, she immigrated to England, arriving in London on the 7th of February that year. 3 years later, on the 7th of March, 1869, she married John Thomas Stride at the Church of Gillies in the Fields, Holborn. The newlyweds then moved to the East End of London, where they opened a coffee shop in Crisp Street Poplar.
That just sounds like a Hallmark movie.
I know, isn't it cute?
Doesn't
the
it sound
beginning is very
cute so far? It's a Swede that moves to London, and then she gets married to, a guy, and they get married in, what was it called? St. Gillies in the Fields?
Giles, or like Giles in the
Oh,
Fields. or something
Giles
like
in the
that.
Fields.
Might
Yeah,
be
Giles or
Giles.
Giles.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
I don't
Yeah.
either. Then they
Only those
open up-
doggone Brits knew how to speak English.
And then they move to the East End of London, and they open up a coffee shop. It
Ooh,
sounds
coffee
cute.
shop. It does. It
Crisp
sounds-
Street is a
Yeah.
nice street to have
It
your
is.
coffee shop on.
It is. It does. All right, let's
sounds
go
picturesque.
to
I
her.
love it.
Let's go to her poor downfall. All right, what happens?
Okay. So the couple separated around 1877, after which Elizabeth began residing at various common lodging houses, and she also became involved with a man by the name of Michael Kidney. So after the next few years, she began drinking heavily, and she made numerous appearances before magistrates on charges of being drunk and disorderly. So for 6 years prior to her death, she had resided on and off at Common Lodging House at 32 Flower and Dean Street in Spitalfields. After a long absence, she had returned to the lodging house on the Tuesday before her death. On Saturday, 29th September 1888, she had spent the afternoon cleaning 2 rooms at the lodging house, for which she was paid 6 pence by the deputy keeper, and by 6:30 p.m. she was enjoying a drink at the Queen's Head pub. Returning to the lodging house, she got herself all dressed up and ready for a night out. At 7:30 p.m., she left the lodging house. There were several sightings of her over the course of the next 5 hours. By midnight, she had found her way to Berner Street off Commercial Road. At 12:45 a.m. on the 30th of September, a man named Israel Schwartz saw her being attacked by a man in the gateway of Berner Street, known as Duftfield's Yard. Schwartz, however, thought he was witnessing a domestic argument and crossed over the road to avoid getting dragged into the quarrel.
Oh my gosh, these useless witnesses. Oh my word.
Yeah, like, if you kind of think though back then, this kind of thing you didn't really want to get dragged into because people were so violent in this area. Like, you would get stabbed just for being involved, like saying something.
Where are they? Are they still are they in Whitechapel?
Yeah.
Okay. To be fair, though, okay, let's say you're witnessing some sort of assault, right? Earlier in the story, as soon as they find a corpse, they're like, I know exactly where the constable is. I'll run to that street. I'll tell him what's going on. That's the first place I'm going. If I'm not willing to step in between something, a domestic like that, I'm going straight to the cops.
I mean, yeah, that could have happened. I don't know exactly like how willing the cops were to like jump in either at this time. But yeah, it makes sense. Like, at least nowadays, it makes sense. Like, you would go like call the cops or go to the cops. But I don't know, because like they were afraid to not walk down certain streets without groups of cops. So I mean, it's hard to know like what their mindset was too. Strahd's body was discovered at approximately 1 a.m. on Sunday, September 30th in 1888, in the adjacent Duftfield's Yard by Louis Demschutz. Demschutz had driven to the poorly illuminated yard with his horse and two-wheeled cart, when his horse abruptly sheeted to the left to avoid what appeared to be a bundle lying on the ground. He later described it as a dark object laying on the ground. Demschutz unsuccessfully attempted to lift the object with his whip handle before leaving his cart to inspect the bundle. While lighting a match, Demschutz realized that the bundle was the body of Elizabeth. He immediately ran inside the club to make sure that his wife was safe. After finding her safe and sound, he reported his discovery before the group promptly dispersed to seek help. So, like, he ran inside to make sure his wife was okay, and then went to go get help from the police. So blood was still flowing from a single knife wound inflicted to Strahd's neck, and although her hands were cold to the touch, other sections of her body were still slightly or quite warm. This suggests that Strahd was killed shortly before Demschutz's arrival on the yard. Several patrons working the men's educational club, who had left the premises between 12:30 and 12:50 a.m., later informed the police that they had observed nothing amiss. So this is like a 10-minute time span of like between like 10-15 minutes of like when she could have been killed. So Elizabeth had an abrasion on her skin about half an inch and a quarter diameter, apparently slightly stained with blood. Her throat was deeply gashed. In the neck was a long incision which exactly corresponded with the lower border of her scarf. The incision started on the left side, 2.5 inches below the angle of her jaw, and almost in direct line with it, nearly severing the vessels on that side, cutting the windpipe completely in two, and terminating or ending on the opposite side, 1.5 inches below the angle of the right jaw, but without severing the vessels on that side. So like the one side of her neck was like completely cut through. So Dr. Blackwell believed that Strahd's murderer may have pulled her backwards onto the ground by her neckerchief, the bow of which was observed to be rather tight. So like she had like a bow wrapped around her neck before cutting her throat. Strahd had probably been lying on her back when she was killed by a single swift slash wound from left to right across her neck, strongly indicating her murderer had been right-handed. Bruising on Strahd's chest suggested that she had been pinned to the ground prior to the wound on her neck being inflicted. And that's basically all she had for injuries, so it's thought that like this one he was just about to get caught, so then he ran away before he could do anything else. So, because like if you look at every single other murder, he does a lot more, but she was just in the neck wound. He probably saw someone coming and fled. So the next one that night was Catherine Eddowes.
What happened to the coffee shop?
They divorced in like I think it was 87 or is it 77? And then I assume that they probably closed after they separated. I'm sorry, your Hallmark movie took a very dark turn.
It did.
I'm sorry. Okay. So Catherine Eddowes was born in Wolverhampton on the 14th of April, 1842. Although her family moved to London when she was a young girl. By the time she was reached her mid-teens, both her parents had died, and she and her siblings were separated, with Catherine returning to Wolfhampton to live with an aunt. Later, she met a former soldier by the name of Thomas Conway, and it was claimed that the couple were married, although no proof of this has ever been found. She had his initials, TC, tattooed in blue ink on her arm. The couple would then have 3 children together, and they earned a meager income by selling what were known as chapbooks. These were cheap books sold on the streets by peddlers.
So, like Pulp Fiction kind of books? Like
Yeah.
little, just...
Yeah, just like little comic book kind of things.
Okay.
Just like little books.
This is fun, too.
At a nice halfway point, like if you're poor, you probably don't have the money to buy a straight up book. So yeah, this would be like probably one of the more cheaper printed materials you could buy.
It's something to do. Yeah, it's cheap entertainment. Yeah, another thing too that women would do at this time would sell flowers. So like either like fresh flowers that they would cut, or they would make like flowers out of like scraps of fabric and stuff, and sell those to like hat shops, because they would make like super fancy hats. And so that would be another thing that they did if they could afford to get like scraps of fabric or find any. But yeah,
women's hats back then looked like full-blown art installations. There's just like birds and flowers and craziness all over it. It's like, I don't know how you keep that on your head in a high wind. I really don't. Lots of pins.
Hat pins.
I'd have to have a little chin strap on it to keep it on my head.
Don't
they? Some did, I think.
Yeah, like scarves or something, right? They would wrap around to secure your hat in place.
So by the end of the 1870s, the couple had moved to London, and they were living in Westminster. Catherine, however, had started drinking heavily, and her alcoholism, coupled with her fiery temperament, meant that their relationship became extremely tumultuous, and the couple repeatedly split up. According to one of the Catherine sisters, Conway was an abusive partner, and Catherine often sported black eyes as a result. So in 1880, they separated for the final time. Catherine gravitated to the East End of London, where she moved into Cooney's Common Lodging House. In 1881, she met a man named John Kelly, who earned his living as a casual laborer in the local markets. The couple would live together as man and wife at the lodging house until Catherine's death in 1888. The deputy lodging house keeper, Frederick Wilkinson, would later remember her fondly as a very jolly woman who was often singing. So each summer, Catherine and Kelly would head for Kent and go hop picking, which is a popular way for East Enders at the time to enjoy a break from the stifling, overcrowded streets, whilst at the same time providing an opportunity to earn a little extra cash. So in September 1888, they set off for their annual hop picking break, but as the hop yield was disappointingly low that year, on account of the unusually wet summer, work was limited, and they decided to return to London, arriving back in the capital on the afternoon of Friday the 28th of September. It's just like 2 days, or like a day before she was murdered. Kelly managed to earn 6 pence that day, and Catherine, having taken 2 pence for herself, handed him 4 pence, telling him to use it to get a bed at Cooney's that night. She told him that she would go get a bed at the casual ward at the Shoe Lane workhouse. Although she did get a bed, there was some trouble at the workhouse. She was asked to leave, and she turned up at Cooney's at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning. And the couple went to a pawnbroker's shop on Church Street, where they pawned Kelly's shoes, using the money to buy breakfast. So, like, basically, she gave him the money to get, like, the nicer bed, and then she tried to get one at the free workhouse. He got kicked out, and so, yeah.
I guess it's only fair then the next day that he had to pawn his shoes.
Yeah.
It's like, you got the nice bed last night. You're selling your freaking shoes.
Yeah, so you can get breakfast, yeah. So that afternoon, Catherine told Kelly that she was going to try and borrow some money from her daughter, and around 2 p.m. they parted. According to Kelly's later testimony, he warned her about the Whitechapel murder, but Catherine brushed it aside his fears, saying, "Don't you fear for me," she told him. "I'll take care of myself, and I shan't fall into his hands." It was never established how she spent the rest of that afternoon, but she certainly did not visit her daughter. She did acquire money somehow, because at 8 p.m. that evening she was arrested for drunkenness on Aldgate High Street by Police Constable Robinson of the City of London Police. So Catherine was taken to the police station, where she was locked up in the cell to sober up, and she fell asleep. By midnight, she was awake and deemed sober enough for release, and they basically let her go around 1:30 a.m. So Hutt escorted her to the door of the police station and told her to close it on her way out. At 1:35 a.m., 3 men, Joseph Laundy, Joseph Hyam, Levy, and Harry Harris, saw her talking with a man at the church passage entrance to Meter Square. 10 minutes later, 1:45 a.m., Police Constable Watkins walked his beat past Pete into Mitre Square and discovered her horrifically mutilated body lying in the darkness. So like all in the span of 10 minutes. So as with previous victims, her throat had been cut and she had been disemboweled, but in addition, the killer had targeted her face, carving deep V's into her cheeks and eyelids. She had also removed and taken her uterus and left kidney. All right, so to go with the double murder, we're going to talk about what's known as the Goulston Street Graffito. This is like one of the coincidences that Kiki talked about in her TikTok as well. The Goulston Street Graffito has been transcribed as variations on the sentence, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." And Jews in this little blurb was spelled Juwes, so not like the normal spelling of Jews. And the way that Jack supposedly spelled Jews, it wasn't normal for like a normal Englishman to spell it. It's like they didn't think he was English, either that or he just didn't know how to write, which is very possible too. And after the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, on the early morning hours of September 30th, 1888, police searched the area near the crime scenes in an effort to locate a suspect. At around 3 o'clock a.m., Constable Alfred Long discovered a dirty, blood-stained piece of an apron in a stairwell of a tenement home. The cloth was later confirmed as being part of the apron worn by Catherine Eddowes, and above it there was the writing in white chalk on either side of the wall, or the black brick jamb of the entranceway. And then, so the chalk is interesting because that's one of the things that Kiki points out in her TikTok about like how Edgar Degas might be like Jack the Ripper, because Edgar, he used pastels and often chalk in a lot of his work. So he probably would have had chalk with him. So that's like maybe a connection. I don't know.
But couldn't you say that like all artists use chalk for their initial sketching?
Yeah, and that's another possibility too. Yeah. So
I love the framing of Kendra as the like I'm the like the nonpartisan, right? And then Katrina is like in court accusing Edgar Degas of being a murderer, and Kendra's like the defense attorney, being like, "Is it not true that many other artists also use chalk?" I just love the idea of Kendra actively trying to like debunk this to protect her ballerina man from being accused of murder.
I mean, it's very accurate. That's kind of what's going on.
That's definitely what's going on.
Do we want to take a break for another fun fact, or we just want to go into the last murder victim?
Kendra, fun fact. Kendra,
I have to find a good one. I gotta find a good one.
Okay.
This one's this one's interesting, I guess. Wait, we've done this one, Katrina, haven't we?
Oh no. What is it?
It's Captain Crunch's full name is Horatio Magellan Crunch.
Oh yeah, we've done that one.
We've done that one.
Yeah, I think you're the one that brought it up.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, it's still a fun fact.
It's still a fun fact. Here we go. President Teddy Roosevelt had a pet hyena.
I think I did know that.
I didn't know that.
I think he had a bunch of weird pets.
Unicorn is the national animal of Scotland.
Scotland. Yeah, I knew that one.
Katrina raising both hands in the air in victory.
Heck yeah. I love Scotland. They're great. Okay.
Oh, dogs, like, I knew this one already. Dogs sweat through their paws, and that's why their paws smell like Fritos.
Ew.
That is inarguably a fun fact.
Mm-hmm.
Boom.
Yeah. I don't have a dog to confirm that, so
they do smell like their paws do smell like Fritos, like Frito feet. Yeah, it's very weird.
Gross. It's weird. Okay, isn't it hippos that like have like red sweat?
Yeah, they got like red sweat, and I think platypi. They sweat like it looks like milk.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah. Okay, you ready to go back into the last murder victim?
The last of the canonical five.
Well, 5.
Yeah, and this is the worst one.
But like, she's the meanest, or
no,
the saddest, or
no.
Like
this is the one where the murderer had the most time.
Oh,
yeah. So prepare yourself, Kendra. Okay. Mary Kelly is the last of the canonical 5, and is also the victim that we know the least about. But her murder seems to be the most grotesque. What we do know about Mary is based off what she chose to reveal about her past to those she knew, and what she did reveal is difficult to ascertain. Indeed, we don't know for certain if her name was actually Mary Kelly or if she just changed it. So, like, basically, no one knows where she came from, where she grew up. She just kind of showed up in London and was like, I'll tell you about my past if I like you, basically.
I'll tell you about my past if I like you.
Yeah. So, according to her boyfriend, Joseph Barnett, with whom she lived until shortly before her death, she had told him that she was born in Limerick, in Ireland, and that her father's name was John Kelly, and that she had had 6 or 7 brothers and 1 sister. The family moved to Wales when she was a child, and when she was 16, she met and married a collier named Davis or Davies. 3 years later, her husband was killed in a mine explosion, and Mary moved to Cardiff to live with a female cousin who introduced her to prostitution. Mary moved to London around 1884, where she made an acquaintance of a Frenchwoman who ran a high-class brothel in Knightsbridge, in which establishment Mary began working. And she told Barnett that during this period of her life, she had dressed well and had been driven about in a carriage, and for a long time, she had led the life of a lady. She said that she had made several visits to France at this time, and had accompanied a gentleman to Paris, but not liking it there, she had returned to London after just 2 weeks. And from then on, she began referring to herself as Marie Jeanette Kelly. So thereafter, her life suffered a downward spiral, which saw her moved to the East End of London, where she lodged with Miss Buckie. Soon after her arrival, she enlisted her landlady's assistance into returning to the West End to retrieve a box which contained supposedly rather expensive dresses from the French lady. Mary had now started drinking heavily, and this led to conflict between her and Miss Buckie, relations between them becoming so strained that Mary moved out and went to lodge at the home of Miss Mary McCarthy. By 1886, she had moved into Cooley's Common Lodging House in Thrall Street. Whilst living there, on Good Friday, April 6, 1887, she met Joseph Barnett, who worked as a portier in Billingsgate Fish Market. The two were soon living together, and by 1888, they were renting a tiny room at 13 Miller's Court from John McCarthy, who owned a candler shop just outside Miller's Court on Dorset Street. Those who knew Mary around this time seemed to have been quite fond of her. According to one acquaintance, she was an excellent scholar and an artist of no mean degree, whilst her friend Maria Harvey described her as much superior to most persons in her position of life. So according to her landlord, John McCarthy, her only fault was that when in liquor, she could be very noisy, but otherwise, he said that she was a very quiet woman. She and Barnett appeared to have lived happily together until the mid-1888, when he lost his market job, and she returned to prostitution, which caused arguments between them, and during one heated exchange, a pane of the window by the door of their room had been broken. The instability of their finances had resulted in Mary's falling behind on her rent, and by early November, she owed her landlord 29 shillings in rent. So on October 30th, 1888, Joseph Barnett moved out, and although he and Mary remained on friendly terms, he would drop by to see her one last time, being around 7:30 on the evening of November 8th. He didn't stay long, however, and several people claimed to have seen her during the next 14 hours. One of them was John Hutchinson, an unemployed laborer who met her on Commercial Street at 2 a.m. on the 9th of November. She asked him if he would lend her 6pence, to which he replied he couldn't, as he had spent all of his money. Replying that she must go and find some money, she continued along Commercial Street, where a man coming in the opposite direction tapped her on the shoulder and said something to her, whereupon they started laughing. The man put his arm around Mary and started walking back to Commercial Street, pushing past Hutchison, who had been standing under the lamp by Queen's Head Pub at the junction of Fashion Street and Commercial Street. Although this man had his head down and a hat over his eyes, Hutchinson stooped down and looked him in the face, whereupon the man gave him what Hutchinson would later describe as a stern look. Hutchinson followed him as they crossed into Dorset Street and watched them turn into Miller's Court. He waited outside the court for 45 minutes, by which they hadn't re-emerged, so he just left. At around 4 a.m., 2 of Mary's neighbors heard a faint cry of murder, but because such cries were frequent in the area, often the result of a drunken brawl, they both ignored it. At 10:45 in the morning of 9th of November, her landlord, John McCarthy, sent his assistant, Thomas Boyer, around to Mary's room, telling him to try and get some rent from her. After trying to get someone to answer the door, Bauer eventually went to the broken window to see if he could see anyone. What he saw was a very grisly scene. He then ran back to McCarthy's shop to tell him what he had seen. So McCarthy would later recall the horror of the scene that greeted him. Quote, "The sight we saw I cannot drive away from my mind. It looks more like the work of the devil than a man. I had heard a great deal about the Whitechapel murders, but I declare to God that I had never expected to see such a sight as this. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight as this again." The police were immediately sent for, and one of the first officers at the scene was Walter Drew, who many years later would recall the horror of what he saw through the window. Is, quote, "On the bed was all that remained of the young woman. There was little left of her, not much more than a skeleton. Her face was terribly scarred and mutilated. All this horrifying enough, but the mental picture of that sight, which remains most vividly with me, is the poor woman's eyes. They were wide open and seemed to be staring straight into me with a look of terror." So, I do have a list or like a description of exactly what happened to her. Do you want me to read through it or no?
Go for it.
Go for it. Okay. Also, somewhat of it's a morbid but kind of cool fun fact. This is one of the first crime scene photos like we still have on record. So like in history, this is one of the first crime scene photos. You can still look it up. I don't recommend you do, but it's an option. Oh no.
I've seen it. And
I'll look it up right now.
Yep. It's insane.
What the heck do I Google?
Just do like Mary Kelly, Jack the Ripper crime scene photo.
Okay.
Should I start reading while Kendra looks for it, then see if she...
Oh yeah, no, read it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So this is what happened to Mary Kelly. Her thighs were stripped.
Oh my god.
The abdomen was removed. The abdominal cavity was empty. Her breasts were cut off. Her arms were mutilated. Facial features were removed. Her neck was severed down to the spine. The left femur was split from the hips downward, exposing the marrow cavity. The uterus, kidneys, and one breast was placed under her head. The other breast was found by her right foot. The liver was placed between the feet. Her intestines lay at the right side of her body. The flesh was removed from the abdomen, and her thighs were placed on the table. The heart was absent from the room. Bed clothing and the right corner of the bed were saturated with blood. About 2 square feet of blood was below the bed. The wall by the right bedstead had several splashings of blood. The face was cut in all directions, numerous cuts across all of her features. The neck was cut down to the vertebrae, and the cuts showed distinct...
Ecchymosis.
Do you know what that means?
Based on the documentary known as the Batman movie starring Robert Pattinson,
Ooh.
I believe it has to do with when the victim was actually killed, like the oxygen in the blood, or like the coloration, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can tell whether or not they were alive after stuff like started to being cut off, basically.
Okay.
That might be complete fabrication, but it has something to do with like alive or dead when it was cut, I think.
Okay.
Feel free to in fact, I'm going to fact check myself.
Yeah.
I'm going to dip my toe in. Keep reading.
Okay, because I just Googled it, and yeah, it's a term for a bruise. Ecchymosis, it's a collection of blood under the skin that occurs when multiple blood vessels close together burst. So basically, it's like a medical term for a bruise. So, I don't know, maybe it is from like, hopefully it's post-mortem. Her breasts were removed by quasi-circular incisions, associated muscles attached to the breasts, thorax visible through the cuts, abdomen, and... Okay, this is like a bunch of like... I basically copied and pasted this because I didn't know how to like...
word it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is like the medical examiner's what he saw, basically. The abdomen and coastal arch to the pubic area was removed. The front right thigh was skinned down to the bone. The left thigh stripped of skin and muscle as far as the knee. The left calf had a long incision running from the knee to 5 inches above the ankle. Both arms and forearms had extensive jagged wounds, and the right thumb had a 1-inch superficial cut. Extravasation of the blood in the skin and several abrasions from the back of the hand. The lower part of the right lung was broken and torn away, the left lung intact. Pericardium, the membrane that encloses and protects the heart, was open and the heart was absent. Partly digested food was also found in her stomach. So yeah, basically he had like 2 hours or more to just like, I don't know, do whatever he wanted. And some people think, so one of the things that Kiki said in her TikTok, why she thinks it might have been Edgar, was because he had a fascination with like how the human body worked, especially like women's bodies. And so she thinks at least like whoever was the murderer wouldn't want to like do anything with the body once like rigor mortis set in. So once you start like freezing up, then like he'd be like, whatever, and kind of just like left after that. So I think that's kind of why like he stopped after like 2 hours. I don't know. Plausibility. Okay, so that is the end of the canonical 5. I still have a little bit to go on Edgar to talk about like or not Edgar, sorry, Jack. Jack the Ripper. I do have like the letters he like supposedly sent, and some like other. I might just skip over like the other suspects because this is already like an hour and a half. Hey Wanderers, editing Katrina here. I just wanted to pop in and explain what this next segment is going to be. So when we recorded with Max, he was on a time schedule, so we wanted to respect his time, so we skipped ahead to the Jack the Ripper Dear Boss letters. However, Kendra and I still wanted to go back and go over like how the police handled things at the time and their possible suspects at the time. It helps give more context to the whole Jack the Ripper lore. So yeah, it'll just be in this little segment, it'll just be Kendra and I talking about it, and then we'll go back to finishing out the podcast with Max.
Here we go, the police investigation.
All right, so now we're going to go back and look more into the police investigation of the Jack the Ripper case. So kind of like looking at, it's like police and forensics back then, there's like next to no forensic stuff, like protocol or anything. The crime scenes were like wiped clean pretty much. They removed the bodies from the scenes and like cleaned it up and like good to go. We'll investigate at the morgue.
They basically like helped the murderer sort of like get away from it. It honestly sounds like, instead of trying to just destroying the crime scene.
Yeah, they did. And we'll get into like how they but like they would wash away blood, which like blood splatter like that in today's forensics is super crucial because you can figure out, like
who it is.
You can like see like where the person was killed, like how the splatter, like what direction they were hit from, like all this sorts of stuff. It's very intricate and cool. But yeah, no, they just were like, we'll look at it, and then
blood's in the way of the get it away. Oh, these fingerprints. Oh, so dirty. Gotta wipe them away.
Whitechapel's so dirty. Clean it up. Get the evidence out.
Oh my goodness, someone lost a tooth here. Ew, get it out.
Nasty. Oh look, there's a knife here too. How odd.
Weird.
It's weird. Okay, so for this part, we're going to be reading through the article called The Police Investigation from the JackTheRipperTour.com. So they go through like a lot of like the facts of the whole Jack the Ripper case, and this is their take on the police investigation, which is one of the more like well thought out articles that I've seen as far as like talking about the investigation parts. So once it was realized that a maniac was on the loose, Scotland Yard was called in to coordinate the investigation. However, forensic science was primitive, the clues few and far between, and most suspects proved to be little of value. And that's the other thing too with the Jack the Ripper case. There were so many suspects that people are just like throwing people out. There'd be like, they originally called one of the suspects, quote unquote, or like they call them the Leather Apron. So that was like one of the names before Jack the Ripper became the name of the murderer.
The Leather Apron?
The Leather Apron. That was like one of his original police, like, what do they call it? It's like the murderer name.
Or something? Like
pseudonyms.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Yep. So the investigation into the Ripper murders was the responsibility of the Metropolitan Police, one of London's 2 police forces. The other force, which was drawn into the murder hunt only with the death of Catherine Eddowes in Aldgate, was the City of London Police. So yeah, so there's 2 jurisdictions in this entire case, but the City of London was only for Catherine Eddowes, which we talked about earlier too, a little bit. So overall, charge of the investigation was given to Detective Chief Inspector Donald Swanson of the Metropolitan Police. The investigations in Whitechapel were conducted by Inspector Fred Alberline and Walter Andrews under the supervision of Chief Inspector Moore. So among others who participated in the hunt for Jack the Ripper are a number of detectives specifically assigned to the task. Principally Sergeant Thick. Also involved was the young constable, Walter Dew. Okay, so at the time of the murders, forensic science was very much in its infancy. It was not easy, if indeed it was possible at all, to distinguish between human and animal blood, and a search for other physical residues such as hair, sperm, and saliva at the scene of the crime was virtually non-existent. No fingerprints were taken either, as a technique of fingerprinting was not used in Scotland Yard until 1901, so about 12-13 years later.
For fingerprints?
For fingerprints. Wow. Yeah, so they couldn't even like swab for prints. Yeah.
It's just like, what do you even do? Like, you don't really even do. I feel like they didn't really have much to do for a murder investigation.
Yeah, and that's the thing is like, so like I think it touches on it later in the article too, but basically all they could do was just kind of like ask around people who saw stuff going on, like heard things, do like very little, like what was scattered around the crime scene, and that was pretty much it. So like detective work was extremely hard back here, back then. Yep. So on the spot analysis largely consisted of looking for clues, such as something dropped by the murderer. Bodies found at the murder scene were removed to the mortuary as soon as possible, and the site of the crime scene cleaned up, like we talked about before. It's like all the blood, all the evidence washed away, basically. A doctor called to the scene was only required to state the victim was dead. A more detailed examination of the body waited until a visit could be paid in the mortuary, often several hours after the body had been discovered. And this is why the abdominal mutilation of the first victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was not found until the body was stripped in the mortuary. So, like, they didn't realize, like, they knew she was dead. She was the first one that was found, and they knew she was dead, but they didn't know why or, like, how. And then when they took her to the morgue and, like, removed her dress and stuff, they found, like, she was, stabbed and, like, her throat had been slit and all this stuff. So police investigations followed up whatever clues they had and sought to establish victims' final movements. Much the same procedure is followed today. The Jack the Ripper investigation focused on tracing suspicious people seen at the time of the murders, looking into the whereabouts of people already known to the police, and questioning local prostitutes. And that's the thing too, is like the prostitutes, like they were everywhere. Basically, that's like their main form of work. So like they're the most basically liable witnesses because they'd be like out at nighttime and they could see all this murder, like crime going on, basically. So one of the earliest suspects was a young medical student, John Saunders. Little is known about him, except that he became insane and died in an asylum. But Home Office papers on the case show that for a while he was a subject of intense speculation in the corridors of power. Basically, because he was a medical student and was a little bit not on the right side of the brain. So then people are like, oh, maybe he did it, which maybe he did. Another early police suspect was Michael Ostrog, who was described as a, quote, Russian doctor and a convict who was frequently detained in a lunatic asylum. Ostrog may have come to the attention of the police because of his state of mind, or perhaps he had attempted to commit a Ripper-like crime, but he was probably committed to the asylum because of his mental state in 1889 or 1893. The police, anyway, would not show that he was in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. So, again, he was like a well-known, like someone who wasn't quite right in the head, and he was a doctor, but he wasn't necessarily in Whitechapel at the time, so they couldn't pin him to it. So after the murder of Anne Chapman, on September 8th, 1888, talk in the streets was about a mysterious individual known as the Leather Apron. The name Jack the Ripper had not been coined, and that Jack the Ripper, like we talked about, or we will talk about, was the name that he himself, quote unquote, we think, gave him through the letters, the Jack the Ripper Dear Boss letters. That's how he wanted to be known, basically. The Leather Apron was alleged to extort money from prostitutes at knife point and threaten to rip them up. The press published lurid descriptions of Leather Apron, who was considered to be a Jew, and on the streets there were unpleasant anti-Semitic reactions. Jews at the time were verbally abused and sometimes physically assaulted. And like we talked about too, like with the graffiti, there was also anti-Semitic things within the graffiti.
All over the place, it sounds like. Everywhere.
All over the place. Yeah,
every
so
nook and cranny.
Yeah. So, yeah. I feel like it's never been a good time to really be Jewish. Like, in history.
It's never been a good time. Ever.
It was just, yeah. It's upsetting. But that's history. Okay. So the police seem to have believed that Leather Apron was John Pfizer, a shoemaker living in Mulberry Street off Commercial Road. On Monday morning, September 10th, Sergeant Thick took Pfizer to Lehman Street Police Station, and his home was searched. When questioned about his whereabouts on the nights of the murders of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman, Pfizer provided cast iron alibis and was released. So that's another one of like the super strong suspects that they had was a shoemaker, because they believed like one of the first weapons they believed to like have committed the murders was a shoemaker's knife, since it was sharp and it's like kind of like a curved blade, so that's why they gravitated towards him. At Chapman's request, which Pfizer attended, there was some suspicion as to why Pfizer had stayed indoors between the night of the Chapman murder and the time he was arrested by Thicke. Pfizer replied that his brother had advised him against going out since he might have been torn to pieces by anti-Jewish mobs. So he himself was Jewish and a shoemaker, and they're like, witch trials, go. So whether or not Pfizer was in fact the Leather Apron is uncertain. He strenuously denied that he was known as the nickname and declared that he had a stainless character. On the other hand, the police must have had some reason with connecting him with the Leather Apron stories, and there is certainly no evidence in any police writings to suggest that they were ever in any doubt about the identification. Pfizer was publicly exonerated in the inquest, and he subsequently took out libel action against the police. Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure like all the facts that they like had on Pfizer, but the two that for sure stick out are, again, shoemaker and that he was Jewish. So which is pretty, like, to them back then with like no evidence, basically no crime evidence, that's all they had to go on. During the week following the murder of Mary Nichols, the police investigation concentrated on finding the Leather Apron, as well as a blood-stained man who had aroused the suspicions of Miss Fittymont, the landlady of a Spitalfields club, the Prince Albert Tavern, only a few hundred yards from the scene of the crime. The second man was probably a butcher named Joseph Ismit, who was mentally unstable and had been out of Colney Hatch Asylum in North London. Eisenschmidt was detained on the 12th of September, and according to Inspector Alberline, was handed over to the authorities as a lunatic. The police soon lost interest in both Eisenschmidt and Fittymont. So another like theory too, or like thought, was like maybe Jack the Ripper was a butcher. But then people a lot of like would bring up the fact of like, well, if he had just murdered women in like these brutal ways, why wouldn't he have blood everywhere? Like, why wouldn't somebody be like, hey, he has blood on his shirt, like he's covered in blood, you know, because they're very bloody crimes. But at this time, it was not uncommon for people just to walk around covered in blood. One, because fighting; two, because like just hygiene was like almost non-existent.
The jobs at the time, yeah. Something, right?
Yeah, so like also like butchers, like they would get bloody at work, and like they had almost nowhere to clean themselves up. Because like they didn't necessarily have houses, they go stay at a DOS house, so they go sleep at a house, and then they'd go back to work. So they wouldn't have like a house to go home, do laundry with stuff. Like they'd just walk around in blood all the time.
Fun.
So like, yeah,
what a fun hobby!
It's joyful time. But yeah, so like it wasn't uncommon to see people walking on the street just soaked in blood.
That's so wild.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so with Chapman's murder, additional policemen were drafted in from other divisions to augment the local H&J divisions, the Whitechapel and Bethnal Green, respectively. The press thought the swamping of the area was ineffectual, and the police were criticized. However, there is evidence to show that the police presence was having an effect on the killer, due largely to the lengthening intervals between the murders. A week between Nichols and Chapman, and 3 weeks between Chapman and the double event of Stride and Eddowes, and then over a month between the double event and Kelly. So,
do you think that the police, you know, kind of scared Jack the Ripper away between the murders, or do you think like, you know, like a lot of like the serial killers, they murder, there's sometimes like there's large gaps of time in between each of their killings?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell. I mean, if he was, because again, at this time, like, police officers were scared to go down certain streets, so without like big groups of them. So I don't know how necessarily that affected Jack the Ripper. It probably was more like he just like felt like he had an opportunity so many weeks later, or maybe it was planned that night. I don't know. It depends. It's hard to know because like we don't know who Jack the Ripper was.
Right.
It's like we won't ever get like a true motive or like know how his brain worked.
Right.
But yeah, it's hard to say. The Metropolitan Police also distributed about 80,000 handbills, or like flyers, requesting the public to communicate anything suspicious to the authorities. The police visited common lodging houses, questioned over 2,000 lodgers, and made extensive house-to-house inquiries. Curiously, these were restricted to a geographical area that excluded both Bucks Row and Burner Street, where Nichols and Stride were murdered. Nevertheless, the area they chose held the greatest concentration of Eastern European immigrants and was dominated by common lodging houses with a correspondingly large transient population. So this is kind of just like saying like they skipped over to like the biggest crime scene areas, as far as like asking people to report what they saw, but they instead went to like places with where like people will be walking around all the time anyways. So Robert Anderson, the newly appointed head of the Criminal Investigation Department, who was out of the country until after the double murders of Stride and Eddowes, later wrote in his memoir, "The lighter side of my official life," quote, "During my absence abroad, the police had made house-to-house search for him, the murderer, investigating the case of every man in the district whose circumstances were such that he could come and go and get rid of his bloodstains in secret. And the conclusion we came to was that he and his people were certain low-class Polish Jews." I think he's just blaming it on them. That doesn't, to me, have much of a correlation.
Yeah, like zero.
So I think he just like was very anti-Semitic as well, and just was like, nah, it's just Jewish people, which is not fair. So whatever the reasons were for this conclusion, it seems that by the end of October 1888, the police were no nearer to identifying the killer than they had been on the day that Mary Ann Nichols was murdered, so the first murder. In a report to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, dated the 23rd of October, Anderson admitted that, quote, "that a crime of this kind should be committed without any clue being supplied by the criminal is unusual, but that 5 successive murders should be committed without or having the slightest clue of any kind is extraordinary, if not unique, in the annals of a crime." There was one clue of sorts. After the murder of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square, a blood-stained piece of a woman's apron was found on a common stairway to a block of flats in Gulston Street, a few streets northeast of Mitre Square. It is found to match exactly the apron that Eddowes was wearing, and had been evidently used by the killer to wipe his knife and hands.
Too bad they still didn't have the apron with the blood, so that I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know what they did with it. They probably just they're like, this is gross.
Threw it out. You're like, yeah.
Don't need that. That's fine.
Took note of it and just chucked it away.
Yep. So this piece of material suggested that the murderer was heading back to the East End, into the very heart of the murder district. While this strongly indicates that he was a resident there and a member of the local community, he may have been forced into taking this route. So like maybe like the police kind of chased them, pushed him that direction as they're like making their rounds. So little is known of the investigation undertaken by the city police into the murder of Catherine Eddowes, the only Jack the Ripper victim murdered within their jurisdiction. Their files were destroyed by the bombing in World War II. Yes, like all that's just gone. And a brief account was given by Major Henry Smith, the commissioner of the city police, in his memoirs, but these have been considered unreliable. So basically, we don't know a lot about her murder anymore, because like, everything just got blown away. As in a precautionary measure, the city police drafted men in plain clothes onto the boundary between the metropolitan and city jurisdictions to check alleys and dark corners and to keep an open eye for suspicious individuals, which is actually kind of smart. It's like some of the first like undercover cops kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of cool. Yeah. So just like walk around without their badges. Yeah. So after Eddowes' murder in Mitre Square, they seem to have placed a value on the description given by eyewitness Joseph Laundy of the man thought to have been seen with Eddowes at the entrance to Mitre Square. The destruction of the city police case papers is a great loss, for not only might there have been greater insight to the approach taken by the city for the Ripper crimes, but they might have also thrown some light on a few mysterious and tantalizing items of information. So after 6 months, the investigation gradually wound down. The expensive special patrols drafted into the Whitechapel had been withdrawn by March 1889, and Inspector Abilene was caught up in the Cleveland Street scandal, in which certain English aristocrats were accused of frequenting a male brothel near Tottenham Court Road. The press and public interest in the Ripper waned, to be briefly revived with the murder of Alice Mackenzie in Whitechapel in the mid-1889. Jack the Ripper case papers remained open until 1892, but no more information was added to them. They remained closed to the public inspection until 1992, but were made available to researchers in the 1970s.
So are they available now for everybody, or no? Just
I believe they are. So yeah, there is like a whole like I think it's like 8 pages I found on like the FBI website that they did in the 70s. Is it? No, it was 1988. But 1988 is I think when they kind of reopened it
last
up and
time?
started looking.
Cool.
Yeah, the FBI did. But yeah, but I believe I can with a little bit of digging, I'm sure you could find
There you
them.
go.
Just kind of
Fun winter
look at them.
hobby.
Hey, there you go.
A fun fall hobby.
A disturbing one, but yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to like look at who they thought were the suspects and stuff too, because there's a lot of Jewish men specifically, and then
Yeah,
like,
specifically.
specifically
Targeted, probably.
yeah, more than a little
More
bit,
than likely, yeah.
more than likely. And then also like if they had like any sort of like medical knowledge or like mental illness or just a job with a sharp knife. That was kind of like the criteria that they had to go off of. All right, so now we're going to skip to the Dear Boss letters, are the letters that were sent to the police stations, supposedly from Jack the Ripper. So the first one, so there's a bunch of letters that were sent around this time to the police station, but there's only 3 that they actually think came from Jack the Ripper himself. And they were the Dear Boss letter, Saucy Jackie postcard, and the letter from hell. So for the Dear Boss letter, it was received on September 27th, 1888, at the Central News Agency. This letter was originally believed to be just another hoax. 3 days later, the double murder of Stride and Eddowes made them reconsider, especially since they had learned a portion of Catherine Eddowes' earlobe was found cut off from her body, eerily reminiscent of a promise made within the letter. The police deemed the Dear Boss letter was important enough to reproduce in newspapers and post bills at the time, hoping someone would recognize the handwriting. A postcard received at the Central News Agency on October 1st, making direct reference to both the murders and the Dear Boss letter, is believed to have been written by the same hand. Whether or not the letter is a hoax this is the first written reference which uses the name Jack the Ripper in reference to the Whitechapel murder. So this is how they got the actual name for Jack the Ripper. Otherwise, they didn't really have like a serial killer name for him. This is what the first Dear Boss letter said. So, Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I've laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I'm down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I get buckled. Grand work on the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went real thick like glue, and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Haha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send it to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife is nice and sharp, and I want to get to work right away, if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Haha. Yeah, so like, he's like the red ink, he basically wanted to write this letter in blood, like in his victim's blood, but it coagulated before he could write with it, so he just used red ink instead. Yeah, so that was the very first letter that they got. The next one is Saucy Jackie. This letter was received on October 1st, 1888 at the Central News Agency. The handwriting is similar to that one of the Dear Boss letter. It makes direct reference to both this letter and the murders of the previous night. So this is what the Saucy Jackie letter says. I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. A double event this time. Number 1 squealed, but I couldn't finish straight off. Ha, not the time to get ears for the police. Thanks for keeping the last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper. And then the last letter was received on October 16th, and it's the letter from hell saying, from hell, Mr. Lusk, SOR, I send you half of the kidney. I took it from one woman and preserved it for you together to piece. It's very broken. If you like read the transcriptions, it's like very broken English. Preserved it for you Together, piece I fried and ate it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife I took it out with, only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. But yeah, if you like look at the transcripts of these letters, it's, I don't know, things are very much misspelled. And it's like kind of
Whoever wrote this letter, if Jack did write this, he calls himself Saucy Jack. I think he might have been on the sauce when he wrote this one, because he's like missing letters, and I think he means sorry, SOR, and it looks like there's like a stem of a Y, but it's not like finished.
Yeah.
Like, or no, that's the I. No, just bad penmanship altogether.
It's very bad. It's either he was on something or he was just trying to go quick. I don't know. But yeah, no, it's like missing letters. I can't decipher it. If you look at the actual pictures of the letter, I can't read it. Like, yeah.
I give your paper an F, Jack the Ripper. Your spelling's terrible.
His penmanship is awful. And they think all 3 of these were written by the same person?
Yes. So like if you look at like how they're written, the penmanship, well, it gets worse. But I think mostly it's because like there's like little snippets of like details from the murders that they didn't post like in the newspaper. So like he would like point stuff out. That's basically why they think these 3 are real. But yeah, no, the penmanship gets worse and the writing gets worse. So I don't know. Okay, so I'm just gonna skip down to go over like the killer profiles that have been put together. So I have one killer profile from the 1888 police, and I found a killer profile from the FBI when they reopened this in 1988, so 100 years later. Yeah, so it's kind of cool. You can see the level of how far we've come.
Improvements in the field of criminology.
I should hope things have advanced.
Yeah,
since then.
I should hope so too.
I hope so. Okay, so from 1888, the killer profile was male, resident. Good job.
Good job.
Good job. A resident of the Whitechapel area, in his late 20s, likely employed as the killings mainly occurred on weekends. Without family ties, as the killings happened between 6 a.m. and 12 a.m., probably of low class, not surgically skilled, likely known as a previous offender, regarded as a loner, and likely abandoned or abused by his mother during his childhood. So that's what they had from 1888, which, I mean, decent.
There's something. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, there's like,
there's something there. I don't know.
There's something there. Yep. So, and then this is the one from 1988 from the FBI. So it says, there is no evidence of sexual assault. He killed his victims swiftly. He always cut their throat very quickly. He was able to control his victims during the initial Blitz-style attack. He removed the organs of some of his victims, indicating some anatomical knowledge. There's no evidence of physical torture prior to the victim's death. Post-mortem mutilation for all the victims. Possible manual strangulation. Blood from the victims was concentrated into small areas. Rings were taken from only one victim that we know of, and the last victim who was killed indoors, was the most mutilated. He spent a significant amount of time at that last scene, and the time of death for all the victims was in the early morning hours. So there's a little bit more a little bit more substance, but still no one really knows, because forensics was really
bad.
It was just barely born. Yeah. So even I think I had it written down somewhere, but they had just barely started doing photos and fingerprints and stuff. There's you can't really do DNA or anything yet, so you just got to go off of what people saw basically. That's it's insanely hard. So it's hard to say if we'll ever figure out who Jack is officially. But there's been a lot of speculation. There was some people thought a butcher, because they'd worked with animals, killed animals, know where the organs are roughly. But Jack's cuts, he knew where organs were, but he didn't do it cleanly like a surgeon would. So they don't think he was necessarily a surgeon. He could have been, but they don't really think so. Then
or in the case of the last victim too, it could also be if the heart is your objective, anything else that's in the way is just you're throwing it to the side. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If the heart missing from the last scene says a lot about his surgerizing of that victim in specific, that it was just okay, cut this out, move it off to the side, throw it to the side. I don't need that. He had a specific thing he was going for, and he was going to get it.
Yeah. And let's see. So I think it's the second or third victim. He also think it was the second one. He like flung her like entrails to the side and then just like left it.
Yep.
So like he probably was caught before he got to what he was looking for. But yeah, and I know like another like suspect that some people think was like H.H. Holmes, because we talked about that last year.
Oh yeah.
Because yeah, he was kind of like the same monster killing.
He had a similar MO. He would
Yeah.
incapacitate victims and then dissect them. That was his. So like once they realized that all these ladies were basically getting choked out or like essentially incapacitated, and then he'd just be able to, like, once you're not struggling anymore, he can just dissect you. Given the fact that on those crime scenes, I didn't know about like the lack of blood at the crime scenes, but that also makes a lot of sense, because if you're trying to kill someone and stab them up and they're alive and they're like actively fighting back against you, that's going to contaminate the crime scene. Like it would be a bloody mess. But if you incapacitate them first and all of the like the mutilations are happening in like one area after the victim is already like on the ground or incapacitated, that would explain why the crime scenes are just like, there's not blood everywhere like you would expect, because he was strategically like, okay, I don't even want the threat of you fighting back. Like, I don't even want that possibility to exist. So I'm just going to knock you out first and then take you apart, basically.
Yeah, like he knew what he wanted. He just, So he had a plan going into it. Just the last one, he got lucky and had a whole 2 hours to sit there. And it's really messed up. So thank you, Wanderers, if you stuck through this whole episode. It's a lot to stomach, and I apologize. But in the next part, we're going to go over some Edgar Degas and like how his life was, and kind of, and why Kiki thinks in her TikTok he is Jack the Ripper. So thank you so much for listening, Wanderers. If you have any suggestions for any future podcasts, please feel free to email us at fwplisteners@gmail.com.
And as always, episodes of the FWP go up whenever they're done.
Thank you, Max.
They go up whenever they get done. And keep an eye on this space and the other spaces too.
Yay, thank you. All right, Wanderers, we'll see you in the next episode for part 2. Bye. That's a thing, being nose blind to stuff. Like even like when I'm working with frosting and stuff for cakes, like I can't smell frosting anymore. It's weird. Yeah, I don't know.
What does it smell like?
What?
Frosting,
like vanilla, sugar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I guess the thought of the scent of frosting has never crossed my mind.
Really?
No.
Okay.
Kendra, you've never walked past a cake and just gotten within inches of it and just breathed in a deep,
just inhaled,
deep lungful? Yeah.
No.
Just on somebody's birthday, just walks by.
I
have to do that.
I'm just here to smell it.
I'm just here to sniff it. I guess I have to change the way I've been living life. Instead of stop to smell the roses, it's stop to smell the cake. Yeah, the frosting.
Sniff the cake, Kendra.
Sniff the cake.